book of Exodus begins with the family names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt. And then the story commences with a new administration. A new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. So the new king doesn't know the backstory, doesn't know the history. And he is filled with fear at the prospect of a country filled with Jews. And he says, look, the Israelite people are too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them. Ooh, it just got dark. Eliyahu. I think it'd be better to put the house lights back up because they need to read these sheets. So if that could, thank you so much. Good.
The house lights went off.
Although I've always wanted to do stand-up in a nightclub, so Valley Beth Shalom lets me do a little bit of that on Yom Kippur, but otherwise it's... The Hebrew is Havanit Chakmalo. Let's be wise about this. And the irony, of course, is that every step he takes further only puts him into deeper trouble. So that they may not increase, otherwise in event of war they'll join our enemies and fight against us and rise from the ground. So attempt number one, to limit the population, they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. But the more they were oppressed, the more they increased and spread out. So the Egyptians came to dread them. And then the second attempt was limited genocide, which is worth a whole morning one day, but just quickly, he goes to the midwives and says, throw the babies into the Nile. Kill the boy babies. And the midwives refuse. The midwives hear a higher calling, and they save them. So finally, what happens at the end, if you take a look on the other side of the page, verse 22, then Pharaoh charged all his people, every boy that is born you shall throw into the Nile, every girl shall live. General genocide. That's the scene. We are living in Nazi Germany in 1938. This is genocide beginning to happen. And now the story clicks. And from going to the macro vision of the story, history, governments, kings, social policy, we concentrate on a micro story. Because the Bible is convinced that history takes place in both places. It is not just the macro, it's not just social movements, technological inventions, it's not just political decisions, it's also the lives of individual people and how they are shaped. And so from the macro of a nation committing genocide against an indigenous minority, we now come to the micro. A certain man of the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. Now why is that important? Well, you could say because a Jewish guy finally committed, and that's history making. But it's more than that, of course. What's going on is the environment is that they're killing children. This is an environment of mass murder. And in that place, sometimes the most powerful and assertive act of civil disobedience, the most strongest protest, is to stand up for life. To stand up for life in the face of death is a remarkable scream of protest. You know that the birth rate among Jewish families in Europe right after the war skyrocketed. People found each other in DP camps and began having children. Because the answer to death is life. And so here we have a guy who says, I don't care what's going on about me. I'm going to marry the woman I love and begin a family. And the woman conceived and bore a son. Now this is a problem. Why? Because all sons get killed. And when she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. Now, the Bible, the Hebrew language, as you know, is based on verbs. And verbs in the Hebrew language have 3-letter roots. I want you to be looking in this text. I know you don't have the Hebrew, but you can just figure it out from the English. Every time you see the verb, resh aleph hey, ra'ah, to see. This is a chapter about seeing. So every time you see a verb where the word see or spied or perceived, or every time circle that word. Here's the first instance. When she saw how beautiful he was, she hid him for 3 months. Now, first of all, that's an odd statement, right? What mother doesn't think her kid's the most beautiful baby in the world, right? What, if he was ugly, she'd say, he's a miskite, take him, throw him in the Nile. I mean, come on. I mean, of course she loves the kid, right? I mean, but so that's not what's going on. In Hebrew, it's vatareh, and she saw ki tov hu. Ki tov. Ki tov does not mean what a shenedik baby this is. Ki tov does not mean what a beautiful child this is. Ki tov is a reference back to Genesis. Every time God created something, Vayar Elohim Ki tov. God saw it was good. She sees Ki tov in him. She sees that he reflects a sort of cosmic goodness. He has a cosmic role to play. She sees that he's different. Ki tov. He has something in him of creative, cosmic, godly goodness. And she's intent on saving this kid. And so she hides him for 3 months. What happens after 3 months? After 3 months, when she could not hide him any longer, she got a wicker basket for him and caulked it with bitumen pitch and put the child in it and placed it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. What happens after 3 months? Well, the obvious thing is the kid gets big and he gets noisy, and you don't want the police to hear him. That could be. I would suggest a different thing, and I think all the mothers in the room will appreciate this. What were her nightmares like? What happens to this poor woman sheltering and harboring this baby? And every time she goes to sleep with the baby at her breast, what does she see in her worst nightmares? She sees Pharaoh's police breaking into the house. She sees them rip the baby from her breast. She sees them destroy the baby in front of her eyes. She can't take it anymore. She can't take the horror in her nightmares. So she decides that she would trust the fates, or trust God, or trust whatever with this baby. And she takes a basket, and the Hebrew word for basket here isn't basket, which would be sal. The Hebrew word for basket is teva. And the only other place where the word teva is used in the Tanakh is Noah's Ark. So once again, this is a cosmic saving baby. There's something about him. The other interesting issue, of course, is that in Egyptian mythology, this is the myth of the birth of the god Osiris, who was also put into a basket and floated down the Nile. So they're parroting the Egyptian myth at the same time. So we put the baby in the Nile, and the baby's floating down the river. And the sister stations herself to distance to see what would happen to him. Now, one of the things, by the way, which I won't spend time on now, but you can enjoy if you read this over very carefully, is that this story is about 5 brave women. Shifra and Puah, the 2 midwives, the birth mother, the sister, and the adoptive mother. The 5 brave women of Egypt are all going to be set against the administration of death, which is the men's province. Women on the side of life, men on the side of death. Women on the side of freedom, men on the side of slavery. It's why the critic Harold Bloom suggested that maybe a woman actually wrote this story. So now comes down to the Nile, the daughter of Pharaoh. Now Pharaoh's done an interesting thing, right? The Israelites have been living there among the people of Egypt for a long time. This is a rooted indigenous minority population. How do you get the native population to turn against the minority? How do you get to do that? If everybody's intermarried with them, everyone has friends, everyone does business, how do you get a native population to turn against the minority population? How did Joseph Goebbels do it? Remember, Jews lived in Germany for 700 years before the Nazis. That they were highly intermarried with German Christian families, that people worked together, lived together, went to theater together, enjoyed social time together. These populations were highly integrated, and yet the genius, the evil genius of Joseph Goebbels was how to make the Germans turn against the Jews. How did he do it? Well, the tool that he used, of course, was propaganda. And the first thing that he said was he identified them. There is a people among us who isn't like us. And once you identify them ideologically, you identify them visually. You make them wear a yellow star. Now, what's the second thing that you do? You castigate them. You say, this identified population that lives among us but isn't like us. You want to know who lost the war for us? You want to know who is tearing down the economy for us? You want to know who is destroying our opportunities and who is stealing our future and who is taking from our children what we worked so hard to earn? It's them. You castigate them. Now, once you've castigated them, Once you've castigated them, and the whole population begins to turn on them and say, well, yeah, of course, because they're the communists, and they're also the bankers.
Yeah. So where's Burt?
Once you've identified them and castigated them, what's the third step? The third step is you isolate them. Get them out of the population. Move them out of the neighborhoods. Move them out of your schools. Move them out of your businesses so they are truly separated. And then once you've isolated them, now you dehumanize them. Goebbels used two metaphors to dehumanize Jews. What did he say? He said, the first metaphor was, they are vermin. Our kitchen is filled with bugs, with vermin. And when you have an infestation of vermin, when cockroaches show up or mice show up, who do you call? An exterminator. And even though it's disconcerting to have some guy come in and spritz poison all over your kitchen, that's the only way to get rid of the vermin. And that's what we're going to have to do, said Goebbels. And then he went one step further and he said, a second metaphor, it was a medical metaphor. Who are the Jews? They are the cancer in the body politic. They are the cancer in the body of the fatherland. And when you have a cancer, you call a surgeon, and the surgeon cuts out the cancer. And true, that's painful, but it's the only way to save the body politic. Once you've dehumanized them, people now see them differently. This is all about seeing. What do you see when you see the other? What do you see when you see enemy, alien, population that is not us, but is responsible for all that is difficult in our lives? That's what Goebbels was a master at doing, and Pharaoh was his predecessor. Pharaoh convinced the Egyptian people that all their tsaras, all their problems, was the fault of the Israelites. He convinced them that they weren't like us. He convinced them that they were aliens, that they were others, that they were a threat, that they were an enemy. So the daughter of Pharaoh comes down to the Nile in order to bathe in the water. And guess what? Take a look. Guess what happens? We're in the text at verse 5. Everybody see it? Everybody see it okay? The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile. Now, presumably, when the daughter of Pharaoh bathes in the Nile, she comes down with a whole security attachment of Secret Service, right?
Here.
Maybe a whole bunch of handmaidens carrying the soap and the shampoo and the towels, right? So this whole group of women go down to the Nile in the morning to bathe.
Okay, then he needs,
and yet,
then he needs it.
while her maidens walked along the Nile, in other words, she's not even the deepest one in the water. They're farther out in the water than she is. She spied the basket. All these other women, but she's the only one who saw the basket. She also has interesting eyes.
And then I thought you probably wanted
the birth mother had eyes to see that Kitovu, that he had something godly in him. Now this other woman's going to see her. She spied the basket among the reeds, and she sent the slave girl to fetch it. Now, the next sentence is kind of interesting. If somebody brings you a basket and there's a baby in it, do you need to open the top to figure that out? How would you know there's a baby in this basket? Was that clear enough? Right?
He's very, and he's a lovely man.
But watch what happens. The Torah doesn't use oral metaphors, oral verbs. It only uses visual ones, because this is not about hearing yet. We'll get to that later. That's Shema Yisrael. That comes in Deuteronomy. Here it's about seeing. When she opened it, she saw that it was a child, a boy crying. What didn't she see? What would her father have wanted her to see? Her father would have wanted her to see enemy, alien, monster, threat to us, disease, evil. She didn't see any of that. What does she see? A child, a kid crying. And she took pity on him.
I'm only here for entertainment.
She doesn't see him as an enemy. She completely defies the propaganda war of her own father. She doesn't see him as an enemy or a cancer or as vermin or as alien or as less than human and worthy of destruction. What does she see? A baby who needs help, a baby who needs mothering. And in case you miss it, because the Torah wants to make absolutely sure you know what's going on, she says out loud, Nebuch, a Jewish child. Well, she doesn't say that. She says, this must be a Hebrew child. How did she know? Well, you could say circumcision, but then the priests of Egypt were circumcised. Anyone watch the movie? Someone said it, the blanket. Because, of course, he was wrapped in a Jewish blanket. Only Cecil B. DeMille, who lived in Hollywood and shopped on Rodeo Drive,
Oh, I see.
would think that there's such thing in the world. It's cashmere. Look, feel it. You know, it's just,
It's like
it still has the price tag on it, right? It's bought on sale. I mean, come on. It doesn't really matter how she knew, but she knew. Now, it's amazing what she sees. She sees baby. She doesn't see alien, monster, threat, cancer, enemy. She sees baby. And she takes it to herself. There's a motherly instinct in her that wants to reach out and help this kid. Then the sister jumps up and says, "Shall I go and get you a Hebrew nurse to suckle the child for you?" And the Pharaoh's daughter said, "Sure." So the girl got the child's mother, and the Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will pay your wages." And the woman took the child and nursed it, and when the child grew up, she brought him to the Pharaoh's daughter. How old? In our days, you're weaned at, what, 12, 18 months, and a little earlier you were weaned at 3. If you saw the movie The Last Emperor, the Emperor of China wasn't weaned until he was 9. I know a lot of Jewish men who, to this day, are not...
I've heard about it. Because you've been a criminal. I've heard you've been a criminal. Yeah, I've heard you've been a criminal.
So she took the child and nursed it, and when the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, who made him her son, and she named him Moshe, explaining, Min hamayim mishitihu, from the water I drew him out. That really isn't their derivation of the word. Moshe is the Egyptian masas. Masas is the suffix that you add to the name of a god. Masas means son of. And the prefix has to be the name of a god. So if you are the son of Ra, the sun god, you are Ra Masas, or Ramses, right? Moshe, Masas, literally means junior, sonny boy, right? And you would normally append the name of a god to the front of that. That's the beginning of our hero. Now we get to the section that our lawyers are going to try to confuse for us. Now, do you all see the white space, or the blue space, the empty space, between the word water and the beginning of the next verse at verse 11? Don't write anything in that space because you don't own it. That's owned by DreamWorks Studios. Jeffrey Katzenberg owns that space. That's the entire movie Prince of Egypt. The entire movie Prince of Egypt fits into that white space because the Torah tells us nothing about Moses' growing up except this episode. The next story is he's grown up. And so the Torah jumps, and now we're going to come to the events for which we're going to be talking today. It says sometime after that, in Hebrew, I'm going to help you with the Hebrew because I brought mine. I know you didn't bring yours. Vayehi bayamim ahem. And so it was in those days.
Yeah.
That Moses had grown up. And Moses is an interesting character now.
That's what I meant.
Because he belongs in 2 places. He has 2 mothers. And basically 2 fathers and 2 families and 2 narratives. He is Prince of Egypt, daughter of the Pharaoh's daughter, or son of the Pharaoh's daughter, Prince of Egypt. He belongs to the palace. He belongs to the power structure. And he's also child of the slaves. And the first question is going to be, where do you belong? The old Union song, which side are you on, boy? And when you imagine Moses coming out to the balcony of the palace and looking down, the question of his identity is an open question. Where do you belong? Remember the movie Schindler's List? That's the question of Schindler's List as well. When we first meet Oskar Schindler at the beginning of Spielberg's movie, he's a consummate son of a bitch. You know, they're throwing a Jewish couple out of their apartment in Warsaw so he can move in. He's bribing German officers. He's sleeping with every woman in the world. He lives in Prague with his wife, but now that he's in Krakow, he can do, or Lublin, he can do whatever he wants. He's just a consummate evil man, taking advantage of the war for his own benefit. And then slowly something changes with Oskar Schindler. Slowly, his character changes, and Spielberg and Liam Neeson do such a beautiful way of showing us the change in this man. And slowly you see that character crack, and something come out of that character. And then there's this moment, and it's also about perception. What's the moment in Schindler's List? You remember the moment? He has a picnic with this absolutely stunning, gorgeous girl. And they're dressed in riding crop. I mean, it's Episgoyishkeit, you know, I mean, with leather pants and leather everything, and, you know, with a whip, you know, it's what... And they're riding on a horse, and they're going to have a picnic and make love on the hillside, and they ride up to the top of the hillside, and when they're right up to the top of the hillside, he looks down, and what does he see? The Nazis have come to liquidate the ghetto of Lublin. And he's watching this. And of course, it's hard to see all the chaos. So in the midst of the chaos, Spielberg does a little photographic trick. The whole movie's in black and white, except for what? A little girl in a red coat. And Schindler follows the little girl in the red coat. And remember, the woman he's with, the girlfriend, says, come, we'll drink wine, we'll make love, we'll fool around. And he's watching, he's transfixed by this. The little girl in the red coat. And suddenly Oskar Schindler finds out where he is in his history. And suddenly something changes in him. Remember? And then a little bit later in the film, he's coming back through the town, and near the train station he sees a huge heap of coats that the Jews have been stripped of as they were put onto the trains. And in the middle of that heap of coats, he sees the little red coat of that girl. And Oskar Schindler breaks. And you wonder, you know, how long will it last? And then the denouement of the movie, that amazing moment of the movie, is you know, where Ben Kingsley, who should have won the Oscar for that movie, by the way, because he's just too goddamn good an actor. You know, Ben Kingsley is playing the secretary, says to him, there's the Perlman family, and they want to see you because they want to ask you to save their daughter and put their daughter on the list. And he loses it. Schindler loses, starts screaming at him. Remember? Screaming at him, saying, you know, what are you, the Nazis are going to get me, they're going to close us down, they're going to destroy all this, and what side are you, what do I care about Jews anyway? And he's yelling and he's screaming and he's putting on his coat, and he's yelling and he's screaming, and Kingsley is putting on his coat, his gloves, and he's yelling, and he puts on his hat, and he gets to the door and he says, put her on the list. And he closes the door, and the audience in the theater I was went nuts at that point. Because that's the moment Schindler decided which side he was on. Here's the moment for Moses. Read this with me. He grew up, and he went out to his kinsfolk. Who are they? Not the palace, but the slaves. And now it says in your Hebrew, it says in your translation, and he witnessed their labors. The Hebrew is much better. Vayar, and he saw, same verb, basivlotam. He sees their suffering. He sees their pain. He sees their agony. Now incidentally, what would the average Egyptian have seen? If the average Egyptian is standing there on the portico of the palace, seeing slaves building the new city, what would the average Egyptian have seen? A greater Egypt coming into being, economic progress, an economy that is growing and booming. Only a Moses sees past that and sees the pain of the human beings who are put to labor making this happen. Only he can see past the political screen and see what's there. Look, we see what our culture teaches us to see. And we overlook what the culture teaches us to overlook. When I came back to LA, I was living in New York City, and then I was living in Texas. I came back to LA with our kids when they were little, in the 1980s, 84, 5, I forgot when. Must have been after Yonah was born. It's about 86, 87. We came back. And I saw something in LA I'd never seen before. I lived in New York. I knew what panhandlers and beggars looked like. New York was full of them when we lived in New York. But LA, this was a better city. This was a clean city. And I remember getting off the freeway one day, and for the first time in my life, I saw a man standing by a freeway off-ramp with a sign that said, "We'll work for food." And my kid was sitting behind me in the car. And he said, "Abba, who is that man?" And I didn't know. What do you say to a kid? How can it be that in a society so prosperous? This was Ronald Reagan's Morning in America. There's a man standing at the free off-ramp, hungry. Will work in a society where everybody's on a diet. Will work for food. I mean, I rolled down the window and gave him $10. Will work for food. I couldn't get my eyes off of him. Now, Now, every off-ramp has them. They have whole mishpachas of them. Santa Monica Boulevard, the whole families, whole families, but you don't see them anymore. They're part of the urban landscape. There's a tree, and a trash can, and a stoplight, and a beggar, and a cop, and a street light. You don't see them anymore. They're invisible. We see what our culture teaches us to see. Before 1948, nobody thought it was wrong that the major leagues of baseball were all white men. And it was Branch Rickey who brought up Jackie Robinson, and all of a sudden our eyes opened up and said, gee, those guys can play ball. And then Willie Mays. And suddenly we saw it differently up until 1955. In cities across America, by the way, north and south, separate public facilities for quote-unquote coloreds and whites. Separate public bathrooms, drinking fountains, waiting rooms in train stations. It was perfectly normal until 1955, when Rosa Parks said, I'm not getting up from my seat. And her minister was one young Martin Luther King, who said, I'll go to jail with you. We'll boycott the bus system. And suddenly the eyes of America were opened up, and we said, you know, it's not right. We saw it for the first time. Up until then, nobody saw it. We saw it for the first time. One last example. I went to Charles Evans Hughes Junior High School in Canoga Park, in Woodland Hills. Boys took electric shop, wood shop, metal shop, and print shop. Girls took cooking and sewing. If the teacher asked everybody in the classroom, what do you want to be when you grow up? All the boys want to be astronauts and cowboys and firemen. Girls had three choices. You could be a nurse, a teacher, or a mommy. Those are your three choices. There was a girl in my class named Laura who wanted to be a doctor. We said, you can't be a doctor, you're a girl. She picked out the smallest boy in the class and pounded him into the asphalt.
I just decided it's the direction.
She said, okay, you can be a lady doctor. Just don't hurt anybody. I took electric shop and metal shop. How many times do you think I've used a lathe since junior high? My girlfriend took cooking. How many tuna casseroles do you think I've made this week? You know. But it was normal. It was normal to assume that women lived in a certain world and men lived in another. My mother used to get mail from the synagogue addressed to Mrs. Burton Feinstein. I once said to her, Mama, your name's not Burton, that's Daddy's name. You know. She said, but that's what polite women are called. You gave up your identity. You became Mrs. So-and-so. That was okay until about 1972 or 3 or 4. And then we had a prophet named Betty Friedan who said, what?
Don't worry about the book.
Are you kidding me? And suddenly the world has changed. We see what we are taught to see, and we ignore what we are taught to ignore. Moses was taught to see economic progress, but he doesn't. He opens his eyes and he sees the suffering of individual slaves. And that hurts him. But you know, the problem is it's hard to see a mass. Schindler needed the girl with the red coat. It's hard to see a mass. We can talk about the Shoah, the Holocaust, 6 million people. That's impossible. What's the most popular, important book of the Holocaust? The Diary of Anne Frank. It's easier to focus on the fate, the terrifying fate of one little 13-year-old girl than to focus on something as massive as 6 million. So the Torah does the same thing. Take a look inside, please.
I know that affects homes.
He went out to his kinsfolk and he witnessed their labors. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsmen. Now this verse is badly translated. Let me read it to you in Hebrew and I'll take it apart for you. Vayar. It's the second time that verb is used in the sentence. He sees. First he sees their suffering, the total, the macro. Then it says Vayar. He sees. Listen carefully. Ish Mitzri Makeh Ish Ivri Me'echav. Again, Vayar, he sees. Ish Mitzri. What does the word Ish mean? A human being, a man. Ish Mitzri. Makeh Ish Ivri. An Egyptian man beating a Hebrew man. Ish is repeated twice. You didn't need that in the sentence. You could have just said Mitzri Makeh Ivri. You just could have said it that way. It would have been so much simpler. But here the Torah wants to tell you what Moses sees. He doesn't see what the rest of us would see. What would the average Egyptian have seen? What would the average Egyptian have seen? Absolutely nothing. What's a slave in the mind of Egypt? A slave is not an animal. A slave is certainly not a human being. A slave is a quantity of labor embodied. In other words, a slave is an appliance. Anyone here get up in the morning and ask the microwave if it slept well? Anybody check with the electric can opener that it's happy in your kitchen, gets along with the coffee maker? Mr. Coffee is happy with it, anyone ask? No, of course not, because it's just an appliance. That's what a slave is. To see a slave master beating a slave is the functional equivalent of seeing a guy changing a tire at the side of the road. It happens all the time. It's what you got to do to get them to work right. You give them a whack, then they work well. But Moses doesn't see that. He doesn't see slave master beating slave. He doesn't even see Egyptian beating Hebrew. He sees two human beings engaged in a transaction in which one is beating the life from the other. And he sees Me'achav. It's his problem. He belongs to this transaction. Now, what is he going to do about it? When you're in nursery school, we teach you a simple formula. Use your words, not your fists. Unfortunately, Moses didn't go to a Jewish nursery school. And his whole life, he's going to have a trouble with this problem. He doesn't know when to use his words. And when he gets emotionally involved, he tends to lose his words. And while he could simply order the guy to let the guy go, he's the prince after all, he doesn't do that. He's so engaged in the rage and the violence and the evil of this moment. He's so engaged in the evil of this moment, he wants to rush in. But look what he does next. He turned this way and that, and seeing no one about. Why is he turning this way and that? Well, one way you can say is he knows he's about to do something wrong, and so he's afraid that someone's going to see him and catch him. That's one way to look at it. I'll suggest to you a different way to look at it. I used to live in New York City. I went to graduate school in New York City. I lived on 121st Street and Broadway back in the old days when living on the Upper West Side was dangerous. And it was after Ronald Reagan had opened up the mental hospitals, and the city was full of crazy people, and every block had a schizophrenic beggar. We got used to it. You'd walk down, and every block had a panhandler. So I'm walking, one winter morning, I'm walking from 121st Street to the subway to 116th Street, and I pass the 118th Street beggar who walks up to me and says, "Hey man, you give me a quarter for coffee?" And I reach in my pocket, and before I could put the quarter in his little cup, his eyes roll up in the back of his head, and he keels over. Ah! Plunk. Now, I'm a California kid. I begin to shriek, "Help! Help! Somebody help me with this guy! Somebody help me!" And I start giving him, a little bit of, chest compressions. And I was going to do artificial respiration, but it was just too gross, And I'm trying to. And here's what happens. I'm right in front of the subway stop. And the subway stops, and people come out of the subway stop. And guess what they do? They walk over me. And I'm shrieking and screaming, "Somebody stop! Somebody help me! This guy's dying! Somebody!" No, they're New Yorkers. They have places to go, things to do, culture to create. They're not interested. Finally, a cop car comes up, and these two police officers come by and say, "What are you doing?" A massage? I mean, what? The guy's dying! Call an ambulance! Oh, yeah, okay, fine. So they call an ambulance. And he survived. He was back on the street 2 days later. No one would stop. Moses sees a man whose life is being taken in front of his eyes. He sees a man who's being beaten to death. And he looks around to see, am I the only one who sees this? Am I crazy? Am I nuts? Am I the only one? And when he sees that nobody else is going to respond, he needs to make a decision. Do you just tuck your conscience away and walk away and say, "I don't want to get involved"? Do you just say, "I don't see it, I'll close my eyes, it's too hard to live in that world, I'll go back to the palace, I'll take a swim, I'll have a little lunch, I'll get over it"? I mean, what do? He doesn't. He engages. And because he doesn't know how to use words, he engages. So he struck down the Egyptian and saves the guy's life. Moses is a man born of a woman who has extraordinary eyes. She can see the truth, the God in every human being. He is raised by another woman who has extraordinary eyes, who can see past the propaganda of her world to see the need and the love that is desired and required from an infant. And he inherits extraordinary eyes so that he can see past all the cultural screens, all the cultural distractions, all the political distractions of the world to see what it is that we human beings do to each other. And when he sees evil, he is overwhelmed with a need to respond. And anyone who follows in Moses' path inherits those qualities. Thanks very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to again participate in this wonderful program. And also it gives me great pleasure to again participate with such outstanding lawyers as we have today and as you've seen over the last 10 years. It's my pleasure to introduce the lawyers, although they're known to everybody here, but for those of you who may not have met Professor Laurie Levenson, she's the prosecutor. She's representing the state in this prosecution. Among other things, she's not only a professor of law, but she's the director of the Center for Ethical Advocacy at Loyola University. And, Laura, I don't know how far that extends, but it'd be nice if some of these political PACs could be given lessons in ethical advocacy. Maybe beyond your jurisdiction. Representing the defendant in this case is the distinguished dean of the Irvine Law School at the University of California, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky. A couple of things. We say he's the founding dean, but I want you to understand this is a big deal. To found a law school in a major university is no simple achievement. And in a very short time, he's produced a very outstanding, very highly respected law school. Can I mention the bar passage? Is that public? 90% of the graduates pass the bar. That's very good.
I just don't need the microphone.
Way up,
Okay.
way up there. And I forgot to mention something about Laurie. She's also the one of the go-to people in Los Angeles for the local press. Anytime they have a question about some sensational case or they like a good quote, Laurie is sure to give it to them. Erwin did more of that at an earlier time, but lately he's out in Irvine. It doesn't seem to be as available to the press, although you'll often see his columns in the Los Angeles Times, and I'm glad to see those. So in any event, you've all been asked to be here today to serve as jurors in the trial of People versus Moses. The defendant in this case is charged with two counts, two charges. They're on your jury form. The first is the charge of murder, and the second charge is a flight from prosecution. Now, this trial it doesn't proceed as trials usually do. Usually, it takes us at least a day, sometimes several days, to select a jury. You've all been selected, and as I understand from the lawyers, you all can be counted on to be fair and impartial and objective, notwithstanding the Rabbi's comments that may have influenced you one way or the other. We're counting on you to be fair and objective. Once a jury is selected, usually we have opening statements, but that's being waived here. And then we have the presentation of the evidence. Again, inasmuch as everyone's dead who's involved in this case, we don't have the need for any witnesses. The record is what you have before you, and this is what the lawyers are going to be arguing from. The next part of a trial, once the evidence is presented, is the time for argument, and the attorneys are now going to argue. Oh, okay. Thank you. I mentioned that after the presentation of evidence, which is on that sheet you have, in a trial we have time for argument, and the lawyers are now going to argue the case, first with the prosecution, then the defense, then the prosecution, and then the defense, and then I will instruct you on the law. So that being said, Ms. Levenson, you may argue the case for the state.
Thank you, Your Honor. I've brought some evidence. And we have a visual as well. So we will put up the PowerPoint. We all know no one is above the law. Not you. Next slide. Not you, not me, and not Moses. And that is the lesson of today's trial. It's a lesson that, frankly, God ultimately has to teach to Moses. And even though I've come to know all of you, you bleeding hearts out there, the truth is that everybody is subject to the law. And it is time to step up to the plate. This trial is not about me, and it's not about Erwin. It is about justice. It's about that each life, even an Egyptian life, is worth something, and that two wrongs don't make a right. And it is wrong, I admit, for the Egyptian taskmaster to beat the Hebrew. But it is also wrong for Moses to react, not with his words, but by killing the taskmaster. So let's start out with the next slide. Who is this guy, Moses? I bet you thought you knew all about him. But the truth is, he's not always a goody two-shoes. And in fact, from the day he was born, he was a fugitive. And this was his getaway vehicle. Moreover, he is a man, next slide, of many disguises. Keep going. Take a look at all the different Moseses that you've been exposed to. He blew hot, he blew cold, and he was never very good about using his words. He always thought it was all about him. And he liked, from the day he was very young, to make his own rules, if you can read that. So, what else do we know about this Moses character? We certainly know that he's a hothead, right? That there are at least 3 times where he used violence when he didn't need to. One we're talking about today is when he killed the taskmaster. The second is when he threw down the tablets. And the third is when he struck the rock. That is 3 strikes against him. Moses was a man who was violent when he didn't need to be. He had lots and lots of power. He didn't need to kill. He was the prince of Egypt, and he could have stopped things simply by having the koyach, we know that legal term, to just say no. But he was a man who was perennially bregus, if you know that legal term. That means sour and mad. So, what else do we know about him? We know that, in fact, he was a little meshuggah as well. Because here is a man, next slide, who would talk to the fire. And if that wasn't bad, it became a burning bush. Moses always thought he was the law. So, why did we bring these charges today? The charges against him are murder and flight from the scene. He killed and had an intent to do so This was not an accidental killing. He made up his mind and decided he would do it. He took his knife. He looked around, and it wasn't because he was looking for someone to help him. This wasn't a Good Samaritan in New York. There are no Good Samaritans in New York. This is a man who knew he was about to go beyond where the law allowed and take it in his own hands and kill the taskmaster. And when he was done, what did he do? Did he step up and say, "I've done something good. This is what we should be doing. This is the Good Samaritan. I am saving my people"? He put his tail between his legs and he ran off to Midian. Who goes to Midian? He flew because, in fact, he knew that he had done something wrong. He had what we call consciousness of guilt. So let's think about the specific charges against him. It was for killing and fleeing. And that's a fun picture. But we really have to think for a moment what that involved. Next picture. Murder. Murder is serious. All human beings are created in the image of God. And nobody, unless they have no other choice, unless there's no other resort, nobody has the right to take human life. This, my friends, was a premeditated killing. How do we know? Look at the text. It said he turned this way and that, and seeing no one about, he struck down the Egyptian and then hid him in the sand, as if to say, I know what I did wrong. I better hide it from everybody. Hide it from the Pharaoh, hide it from the Hebrews, because the one thing everybody knows is killing is wrong. He killed an innocent person and he fled the jurisdiction. So what do I think the defense will be? With this defense counsel, I never know. It's always brilliant. But I'm going to guess he's going to raise the same defense that Rabbi Feinstein tried to feed to him. And that defense would be defense of another. I have a response to that, because we often hear, well, he was beating the Hebrew. He had to come to his defense. Maybe that's true, but that's not the same as having to kill him. And Moses, of all people, had alternatives. He was the prince of Egypt. He could have pulled off the taskmaster. He could have just ordered him not to do it. This wasn't a last resort. This was the hothead getting angry. And what we don't want to allow is the Bernie Getz, if you remember him, the subway vigilante. You don't want to allow him today, and it wasn't proper, next slide, for him to do it then. It was vigilantism. Instead of going to the law, what part of thou shalt not kill did Moses not understand? In the end, what did Moses need to do? Next slide. Next slide. He needed to just say no, right? And use his words. So no matter what Dean Chemerinsky says, he has a problem. First of all, he has a problem because we actually don't know that the taskmaster would have killed the Hebrew. He was beating them, but the Hebrews were their workforce. They needed them to build the buildings, and they treated us harshly. But it's a big leap to say, because he saw someone get hit, and he had not perhaps anticipated it, that that would be the same as trying to kill. And moreover, even if undue force was being used, Moses had an alternative. And it's only when you have no alternative that it's necessary to kill. So I'm going to, next slide, point out one last thing. How do we know that what Moses knew he was doing was wrong? He knew it because everybody knew it was wrong. Even the Hebrews knew it was wrong. Because you remember the comment they make to Moses, "Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptians?" The Hebrews themselves didn't see Moses' actions as protecting them. They instead saw a wild man who thought he could kill anytime he wanted. And that's why they confronted him and said, "We saw what you did, not the Egyptians. And what you did crossed the line." Next slide. The bottom line is, two wrongs do not equal a right. I have it on good authority that Moses was not a Democrat and not a Republican. He was just another person. And that is true. And therefore, he cannot say that he has the right to make judgments about life. In the end, we need to convict Moses, to say it's the law that's at the highest, not the man. And in the end, slide, you have to do the right thing. For you, that's a guilty verdict. Thank you.
Dean Chemerinsky, you may argue for the defense.
Do you want to turn up the lights? Judge Pines, Professor Levenson, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it's a pleasure to be before you again. Thank you so much for giving your Sunday to be with us today. All I could think as I listened to Professor Levenson is, there she goes again. For the last 10 years, she's come before you, and look who she's prosecuted. Abraham, the father of the Jews, the patriarchs and matriarchs, even Eve, David, the king of the Jews, and now Moses. Has she no shame? Can't she just let them rest in peace? How many of you remember the name Kitty Genovese? I can't see you. Most of you seem to. Kitty Genovese was a woman in 1964 who was brutally beaten and stabbed to death, and a group of onlookers did nothing. And it was a national embarrassment. It received a great deal of attention, as evidenced by how many of you remember. And this is really what this case is about. When Moses saw another person being beaten, should he have walked away or should he have taken action? And what could he do under those circumstances? And I believe that what this passage is ultimately there to teach us is that as Jews, we're not supposed to walk away. We have to take action, even if necessary to take an innocent person dire action. And so I have a very straightforward argument for you this afternoon, and that's that what Moses did was justifiable homicide and therefore not a crime. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation for you. Even after 10 years, I've never learned how to do PowerPoint. I don't have props. I've not been to Target recently. I'm not going to demand to see the fingerprints on the knife. In fact, I'm not even questioning the fact that in the passage it says nothing about a knife. In fact, in the passage it says a lot of things that aren't in Laurie's presentation. But that's not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about is why what was done is justifiable homicide. And I'm going to make 4 points for you this afternoon. First, justifiable homicide is not a crime. Now, I began, as everyone now begins their research, with a Google search. So I typed into my computer, justifiable homicide. Of course, I also warned my wife and children, should they go and use my computer, and they see I'm researching justifiable homicide, not to be worried. And I found the uniform crime reports that are prepared by the United States Department of Justice. This is what counts and characterizes crime in the country. And it says, and I quote, "The killing of a felon by a private citizen or peace officer during the commission of a felony is justifiable homicide." Well, I then went and looked to the leading criminal law treatise and looked up justifiable homicide. Notice what it says. Justifiable homicide is the killing of one person by another that is committed without malice or criminal intent. When a person commits a justifiable homicide, they are not guilty of a crime. Homicide can be considered justifiable if it is committed in self-defense, the defense of others while trying to prevent serious crime, and in the line of duty. But you will be instructed as to California law. So I look next as to California law. In California Penal Code Section 197 provides the criteria for justifiable homicide. Let me read you directly from the statute, for this is the law you will have to apply. It says, quote, "Homicide is also justifiable when committed by any person in any of the following cases. 1, when resisting any attempt to murder any person, or to commit a felony, or do some great bodily injury upon any person." And this, of course, is the way the law should be. That if a person needs to kill, then self, or to prevent others, and other deaths, prevent felonies, the criminal law shouldn't punish that person. When a person kills in justifiable homicide, there's not the criminal intent that's required for punishment. There's not the criminal act that's required for punishment. That's why, going back to biblical times and every society since, justifiable homicide is not a crime. This brings me to my second argument. What Moses did was justifiable homicide. Ultimately, there's just two questions that you as jurors need to answer today. One is, was Moses' action necessary? And second, was it to prevent a serious felony where there was imminent bodily harm to another? And I think for each of these questions, the answer is clear. Was it necessary? Now, the rabbi, when he was here, Professor Levenson, said Moses should have used his words. I think what's ignored by that comment is the context. In fact, I think one word was conspicuously absent from Professor Levenson's presentation, and that was slave. The person who was being beaten wasn't just another person on the street. It was a slave that was being beaten. And it's the nature of slave societies that slaves are powerless. What words could Moses possibly have used that would have caused the person doing the beating to stop? What evidence is there in the passage that any words could have possibly halted it? Now, in our society, in Los Angeles, say, well, get on your cell phone, call the police. That wasn't there. We don't know if there was a police officer. We don't know if the police officer could have possibly come in time. But even most important, what's the likelihood that a police officer in the context of a slave society would have ever reacted to protect the slave? It isn't our society. It was a slave society. And one has to remember it was a slave society where there was no respect for Jewish life. Just a couple of passages above where this occurs in the Bible, there is Pharaoh ordering the death of all Jewish boys. So in a society where there's no respect for Jewish life, where there's every reason to believe that the person is going to be savagely beaten and even killed, isn't the action that was taken here necessary? The only alternative, at least to prevent a felony, if not to save a life. Well, that leads to the only other question you have is, was there a felony going on? And of course there was. You're told that the person is being beaten. It's true. We don't know how seriously the person is being beaten. We can't know that from the passage. But given what we're talking about, in terms of the lack of respect for Jewish life, is there any reason to believe that it was just a mild slap or a punch? Wasn't the beating much more likely, serious, even fatal? Under the law of California, under the law of every jurisdiction, this is justifiable homicide. The third point that I want to make for you this afternoon is that Moses' flight was not a crime. That's the other thing that he's charged with here. And I think the answer to this is found directly in the language of the passage you were given. And I quote from it. It says, "When Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses, but Moses fled from Pharaoh." So was Moses fleeing from prosecution? No, Moses wasn't going to face prosecution. It wasn't that Pharaoh was going to bring Moses into a courtroom and charge him with a crime and give him due process. Pharaoh was going to have Moses killed. Well, under those circumstances, Moses' flight completely justified. Every jurisdiction allows self-defense. Moses' flight, if nothing else, under the words that you have, was clearly self-defense. Necessity is always a defense in the criminal law. What Moses did was necessary here under the circumstances, and under those circumstances, in that situation, it wasn't a crime. But fourth and finally, I want to say to you that if you have any doubt, it has to be resolved in favor of Moses and in favor of a not guilty verdict. You will be instructed by the judge that the prosecution has the burden to prove her case beyond a reasonable doubt. That means that if there's any doubts in your mind, they must be resolved in favor of the defendant. And I readily confess and admit to you that there are things that are left out of the passage. As I said earlier, we don't know how seriously the Egyptian was beating the slave. We don't know who else was around or what the circumstances were. But what the prosecution wants to do is have you draw every inference against Moses. The criminal law doesn't allow you to do that. Every inference has to be drawn in favor of Moses and in favor of vote for not guilty. I think there's another reason here why you should come to the conclusion of not guilty. It's interesting that God does not condemn Moses in this passage or later for what Moses did. We know that God condemns murder. It's part of the 10 Commandments that were given to Moses. But this wasn't regarded by God as murder. Why? Because this was Moses standing up against injustice. This was Moses protecting an innocent person. And if God didn't judge Moses guilty, you shouldn't either. Not guilty is the only appropriate verdict here.
Professor Levenson, your final argument.
You. Nice try. Ladies and gentlemen, this is my opportunity for rebuttal. Now, these trials are a little odd. One thing that's odd is that I'm supposed to get the last say. But the rules of this courtroom seem to be very different. We give Erwin the last say. That means that when I'm finished, I'm counting on all of you, you in particular, to think about what are the sneaky things Erwin tried to use in his argument that Laurie won't have a chance to respond to, because he made up the rules that he's going to get the last argument. But I want to give you the rebuttal that I have right now. First of all, slide. Just because Erwin says it doesn't make it so. And there were so many reasons that this applies today. First of all, Erwin who I have enormous respect for, made it up. You will get jury instructions from Judge Pines. He'll tell you about defense of another. And I challenge you, as you listen to these, to find one word in this that says you can go about killing somebody because they're committing a felony. You heard that, but it's not in the law, because that's not how you would want the law to be. You don't want people to be able to take a life just to stop a felony. Did you know that in California, it is a felony to steal one avocado? That's because the avocado lobby is very strong in California. So it couldn't possibly be. And it is not. And Judge Pines will not say that it's the law that you can go ahead and kill somebody because they're committing a felony. Every life is valuable, even that of a person committing a crime, and we only allow a justifiable homicide if there are no other alternatives. And the language you will hear is that you're using the force that is necessary. And that's what's missing from the defense argument. Because, in fact, Moses did need to take action. I applaud him for action. But he didn't need to kill. He had other alternatives. We heard about, but it was a slave culture. There were the haves and the have-nots. Next slide. But we've heard his view, Dean Chemerinsky, about vigilantism even in our society, where there are the haves and our have-nots. He wrote an entire article, a troubling take on excessive force claims. And notice, you can buy it for $9.95 on Amazon. Dean knows that it doesn't matter what society you are in. For as far back as we have said, and God has said, killing is wrong, we only allow it in the narrowest of circumstances, when there's nothing else you could do. And Moses, in this case, could not show that there's nothing else he can do. Now, I heard Dean Chemerinsky say, but give him every doubt. Why not? But this is an affirmative defense. We've proved our case that it was a premeditated killing. Now it's up to him to show that, in fact, this was a justifiable homicide. If there are vagaries, if there are things missing, it's up to him. And he hasn't shown, by any stretch of the imagination, that there's nothing else that Moses can do. Even his first example, the Kitty Genovese case, I thought, wow, that's good for me. Because no one was saying that those people should have jumped out of their apartments and killed the attacker. What they said is that they should have taken some action. Moses had the ability to take more action than anybody else in Egypt. He could have stopped it by saying no. He might have even thrown a punch, and we wouldn't be here today. But what he did, hand me that knife, Your Honor.
Please.
Please. What he did is something we can never go back and change. He took a life. He took justice into his own hands. He became the vigilante. There are many reasons to convict in this case. Killing is wrong. Next one. Moses knew he was wrong. That's the whole thing. Even Moses knew he had lost his temper. And okay, God didn't smite him on the spot, because maybe God needed him for something down the road. Maybe God needed to harness that anger. Maybe God needed to teach him over and over again not to be a hothead. But unquestionably, Moses knew before he did it, when he looked around, and after he did it, when he fled, and when the Hebrews told him, "What did you just do?" He knew, and they knew, that it was wrong. Moses fled rather than defend his position. God had to teach him not to be violent, and Moses' actions, if you think about it, didn't make things better for the Hebrews, right? They just made things worse. He kills off one taskmaster, and then he puts his tail between his legs and he runs off. And what do you think it was like for the Hebrews for the next decades when he went off to be with his sheep? It was not good. And that's one of the big problems with being a vigilante and taking the law in your hands. You do things that are not reasonable. Next slide. Today. Yes? If not, how do we know it wasn't reasonable? Look at the look on that guy's face. Does he need to be killed, or is he scared enough? Next slide. A guilty conscience needs no accuser. That's the law as well. And in fact, you're going to get a jury instruction, and this one I'm actually going to use the words in the law, unlike some. If the defendant fled immediately after the crime was committed, or after he was accused of committing the crime, that conduct may show that he was aware of his guilt. That is an instruction that you're going to hear from Judge Pines. Next slide. Moses' temper was always his downfall. Why is it important that you vote guilty? It's important because God is not judging this case. And we know that that's an important part of our tradition. It's up to us to judge cases. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. We have to seek justice. Why once, twice? Because it's not so easy. Sometimes you have to take a second look when people say, "Oh, it was necessary that I kill," and say, "No, it wasn't. What you did might have had some noble aspect to it. And you know what? We'll take it into account at sentencing." In fact, I will guarantee right now that I will only seek probation against Moses. I might even let him back into the Pesach Haggadah. But I will not let him walk away with murder, because I believe in the rule of law. The rule of law matters, not just when it is easy, not just when we use it against the other guy, not just when we use it against non-Jews. The rule of law matters when we hold our own leaders to the highest standards. And ladies and gentlemen, it's for that reason, and because in this situation, the defense has not shown that this was necessary, that this was the only reasonably necessary task that he should have done. It's for that reason that I'm going to ask you to return the verdicts. And on the flight evidence, Pharaoh was mad at Moses. But Pharaoh wasn't breathing down his neck. He put out the word, "What has Moses done?" And since Moses didn't even tell Pharaoh why he was doing it, Pharaoh was really angry. And Moses might have felt like, Pharaoh's going to come get me. But if you're going to be a leader of a people, step up, believe in the law, and stand by your position. Otherwise, face this, the verdicts of guilty and guilty. Thank you very much. I better take this away.
We agree, of course, that killing is wrong. We agree, of course, that no one, not even Moses, is above the law. But there's two very different accounts of the story that you've heard. And here you need to look at the evidence, which is the parsha, the passage before you. Professor Levenson wants to say that Moses killed in anger. How many times did she use that word in her two presentations? I ask you to read the passage that's before you. There's no mention of anger there. There's no implication of anger there. In fact, the other two examples that she presented earlier of anger, throwing down the tablets, slapping the rock, occurred far later and irrelevant to this instance. There's no basis for her conclusion that this was a killing in anger. I offer you an alternative version of what happened. Moses was walking in a slave society. He saw somebody beating a slave. He stood up against the injustice in the only way he could. You can think of this in the context of other societies where there's grave injustice. You could imagine if somebody in Germany in the 1930s saw somebody beating a Jew. What was the individual to do under those circumstances? To yell, "Stop beating the Jew"? How likely is it that that would work? To take out a weapon and threaten? Well, that's in itself a crime, and it may require that action be taken. Or think of it in this country during slave times. If somebody was going down the road and saw a slave being beaten, what could be done? Walk away or step up against the injustice? And I believe that that's what Moses did here, and he did it in the only way possible. He stepped up against the injustice. So I made 4 arguments for you when I was standing here a few minutes ago. First, that justifiable homicide is not a crime. And I wasn't making it up. In fact, I have a copy, and if you've got an iPad or a laptop, you can look it up yourself. It's California Penal Code Section 197. And Laurie, I quoted to you verbatim. Homicide is also justifiable when committed by any person in any of the following cases. And it gives 4 situations. 1, when resisting any attempt to murder any person or to commit a felony or to some great bodily injury upon any person. Now, this case isn't about stealing an avocado. This case is about preventing serious bodily injury or even death. So that led me to the second argument. What Moses did is justifiable homicide. And justifiable homicide is not a crime. And here Professor Levenson is correct that you will be instructed. And the jury instructions will say to you, did the defendant reasonably believe that a person was in imminent danger of being killed or suffering great bodily injury? That's point 1 in the jury instructions for you. The defendant reasonably believed that a person was in imminent danger of being killed or suffering great bodily injury. Read the passage. Doesn't it tell you that Moses had reason to believe that the person, the Israeli, the Hebrew who was being beaten, was at least in danger of great bodily injury? This is a culture that had no respect for Jewish life. Pharaoh had ordered the death of all male Jewish babies. Can't you then infer from the passage before you that there was fear of great bodily injury? Second, the defendant reasonably believed the immediate use of deadly force was necessary to defend against that danger. And third, the defendant used no more force than was reasonably necessary to defend against that danger. That's, of course, what Laurie's focusing on here. And what you have to ask yourself is, under these circumstances, in that culture, were there alternatives? The only one she mentions is Moses could have used his words. How likely is it was Moses yelling to the Egyptian beating the slave, "Stop it," going to have any effect? There's no likely police officer there to call or to summon. There's no authority there to gain. So what choice did Moses have under those circumstances but to use force, even deadly force, to save the life of another? And that's really what this was about, because there's every reason to believe that the Hebrew being beaten was going to be beaten to death. And Moses used deadly force because it was necessary to stop it. And of course, killing is wrong, but there are instances where killing is also necessary. And that's what justifiable homicide is about. Third, I argue to you that his fleeing was not a crime under these circumstances. Now, when Professor Levenson was up here, she said, fleeing can be evidence of criminal intent. And of course, this is right, but again, you have to look at context and circumstances. Was Moses' flight an indication of a guilty conscience? Was Moses' flight about escaping prosecution? Read the evidence again. Look at the passage. The passage says to you, when Pharaoh learned of the matter, he sought to kill Moses. Moses wasn't going to be prosecuted. Moses didn't flee because he believed he had done something wrong and had a guilty conscience. Moses fled so as to save his life. That's self-defense. That's necessity in any jurisdiction. Fourth and final, I say to you, if you're uncertain, if there's ambiguity, then that's why you have to acquit. It's the nature of having this passage that there's things that we don't know. So, for example, we don't know that when the person was being beaten, it was likely to be beaten to death. I think in the context we can infer that, but we can't know for certain. We also can't know that when Moses killed the person, the Egyptian who was attacking the Jew, that Moses had a criminal intent. Laurie assumes the criminal intent of Moses, but for all we know, it could have been an accident. There's so much we don't know. But it's the nature of the criminal law that when you don't know, you give every inference in favor of the defendant. That's what proof beyond a reasonable doubt is all about. For the last 10 years, we've had the good fortune of being on the stage and trying biblical scenes and biblical characters. I don't believe that the Bible is literally true. I don't believe that Eve was created from Adam's rib, or that Jonah was swallowed and lived in a whale, or even that the world was created in 7 days as we define days. I believe that the Bible is a set of stories for us to learn from. And I think there is something very important to learn from this story. It's the importance of standing up against injustice. There's no doubt in this story that there was a great injustice. An innocent person, a Hebrew, was being beaten as slaves too often were. And we have no doubt either that what Moses did was stand up against that injustice. And I think that's why this passage is in the Bible, to teach us, and teach all of eternity, the importance of standing up against injustice. And it's for that reason, on both of these counts, you must vote not guilty.
Thank you, Counsel. Could we have the lights on? Is it possible to turn the House lights up? Thank you. Okay. So now that you've heard the argument of counsel, it's my obligation to instruct you on the law. Can you all hear me? Is this working okay? Good. Now, I'm going to instruct you on California law, and I'm actually going to be reading actual instructions that we give to juries in California courtrooms every day. We all recognize that this event, the alleged event, took place in another country at another time, at a time when neither California nor these laws were in existence. There's a certain ex post facto problem here, but the attorneys have agreed that this trial would be pursued under California law. And the first instruction I'm going to give you is the traditional instruction that we give on the presumption of innocence and the people's burden of proof and the standard here. And what we say to juries is this: a defendant in a criminal case is presumed to be innocent. This presumption requires that the people prove a defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the standard of proof in our state and throughout our nation. Other nations don't follow that. Many nations require that a defendant has to prove his innocence. But in California, we require the people to prove the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof that leaves you with an abiding conviction that the charge is true. The evidence need not eliminate all possible doubt because everything in life is open to some possible or imaginary doubt. In deciding whether the people have proved their case beyond a reasonable doubt, you must impartially compare and consider all the evidence that was received throughout the entire trial. Unless the evidence proves the defendant guilty beyond a reasonable doubt, he is entitled to an acquittal, and you must find him not guilty. Now, as you've heard, there are two charges. The first count alleges the crime of murder. To prove that the defendant is guilty of this crime, the people must prove, 1, the defendant committed an act that caused the death of another person, and 2, when the defendant acted with malice aforethought. The defendant acted with malice aforethought if he unlawfully intended to kill. Malice aforethought does not require hatred or ill will toward the victim. It is a mental state that must be formed before the act that causes death is committed. It does not require deliberation or the passage of any particular period of time. So that's the definition of murder. The second count here is the charge of flight from prosecution. The law states, whoever flees from a jurisdiction in order to avoid prosecution or custody or confinement after conviction under the laws of the place from which he flees for a crime punishable by death or which is a felony under the laws of the place from which the fugitive flees is guilty of the crime of flight from prosecution. Obviously, the defense in this case is one of justifiable homicide, namely the defense of another. The law states as follows. The defendant is not guilty of murder if he was justified in killing someone in defense of another. The defendant acted in lawful defense of another if, 1, the defendant reasonably believed that a person was in imminent danger of being killed or suffering great bodily injury. 2, the defendant reasonably believed that the immediate use of deadly force was necessary to defend against that danger. And 3, the defendant used no more force than was reasonably necessary to defend against that danger. The defendant is only entitled to use that amount of force that a reasonable person would believe is necessary in the same situation. If the defendant used more force than was reasonable, the killing was not justified. The prosecution relied on flight as evidence of guilt. I'm going to give you the instruction. If the defendant fled immediately after the crime was committed or after he was accused of committing the crime, that conduct may show that he was aware of his guilt. If you conclude that the defendant fled or tried to flee, it is up to you to decide the meaning and importance of that conduct. So those are some of the key instructions. Ordinarily, we give jurors a lot more, but we're conscious of your time. So you all have verdict forms, and you now need to complete those forms. They'll be counted during the lunch break, and then once the verdicts have been tallied, an announcement will be made.
Your Honor, may I make a quick announcement? Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, before you submit your forms, I'm not going to re-argue the case. That would break rules. I am going to thank our distinguished jurist for his service, not just on this trial, but on many trials. It's been a great honor for me to have an opportunity to be involved in these trials with my dear friend, and you must know that I adore Dean Chemerinsky. I don't always agree with him, but that's only in this room. And for Judge Pines, he is one of the most distinguished jurists that we have in our community. And he takes these responsibilities, as all of his responsibilities, very seriously. So I want to thank him as well. And this is not sucking up to the court. This is genuine admiration. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you. You want to say something? I wanted to thank everyone as well.
I agree with Laurie totally on that.
Thank you. Look, this has been my pleasure as well. This is a wonderful event. It's always entertaining. It's been my pleasure to have presided over some of these trials. Judge Wapner did it before I had this opportunity. But you know, while both these attorneys are quite entertaining, they're also gifted advocates and great scholars. And you're not only being entertained here, you're being given some real gems in terms of how the law works, what the law is, what it means to live in a country where the rule of law governs us, and to witness such great advocacies. I know people often try to avoid jury service, yet every time these events are advertised, they're sold out in 2 weeks. I only wish we had Professor Levenson and Dean Chemerinsky in court every day. We might get a lot better turnout of our jurors. But on that score, if you are summoned for jury, I urge you to jury service. I do urge you to comply. I think you will value that experience, and you will see what really goes on day to day in the courtrooms in Los Angeles. So I want to thank you all for this opportunity. Wish you all the best.
Hillside Memorial Park is grateful for the opportunity to sponsor this iconic event for the last several years. As we all know, this is the final trial with this group of people. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank them for educating us, making us laugh, and providing such a meaningful event for us to be a part of for so many years. I'd also like to especially thank...
Speak into the mic, please.
Sure, sorry about that. I'd also like to thank Gotti Levy for his hard work and trust in Hillside as a supporter of the Now on to the verdict. On the charge of murder as charged in the indictment, we, the jury, find Moses not guilty. I couldn't read what I wanted.
Recount.
On the charge of flight to avoid prosecution as charged in the indictment, we, the jury, find Moses not guilty. Thank you very much.
So more specifically, so you'll know, on the charge of murder, 29% of you voted guilty and 70% of you voted not guilty. On the second charge, to fly to avoid, is 27 of you voted guilty and 70 voted not guilty. I will tell you that in past cases, they were much closer, the verdict. So this one is a pretty big victory, so congratulations. Once we win, we move on, Laurie. But Laurie, let me start with you. We made a big deal today about the fact that you prosecuted on this stage, some of the biggest names in our religion, from King David to Eve to the Joseph brothers and Rebecca. As Erwin started with his presentation today, the main question is, Laurie, how do you sleep at night? And how
I sleep really well because I feel like I'm walking in the tradition of our rabbis and our sages. We've always questioned. The wonderful thing about our tradition, right, is that these are all people, human beings. They're not divine. They make mistakes. And whereas the standard for a criminal case is pretty darn tough, I just enjoy the opportunity to engage in the learning. I particularly enjoy it with Erwin, because I know that he's going to test every issue, and it makes me think deeply. And I'll just add, it also makes me think about the difference between the legal standards and some of the moral and ethical standards. So you can call me the big loser, but I actually feel like quite a winner today, just to be able to...
Erwin, you became the go-to lawyer to defend all top biblical figures. How do you deal with this responsibility?
I got to defend Moses today. It'd be kind of embarrassing if the verdict came out the other way. Even the best prosecutor in the world, Moses is the defendant. I agree with what Laurie said. I think where these trials have worked the best is like today, where there's an underlying principle that really needs to be thought through. And I do think that Laurie's point was such an important one, that no Moses above the law. And yet I think there's also an important point in the story, as I was trying to say, about we're responsible when we see injustice for taking action. And I think when we're able to use these stories from the Bible to bring forth those moral and ethical issues that are just as important today as when it was written, I think this is serving really a very high mission. I'm so honored to get to be part of it all with you.
Gotti, I will add, it's a heck of a lot more valuable than talking about Lindsay Lohan. But I'll prosecute that one as well.
How do you guys go about preparing for the case? I know, Laurie, your PowerPoint presentation became legendary in this program. So clearly there's a lot of time, and I know I will also tell you, the audience, that there's a lot back and forth between the two lawyers about what the charge actually should be. Murder in the first degree, murder in the second degree. I myself don't know the difference. But they really, there was back and forth, and I know that Jane used to come to my office and say they can't agree on the charge. So there's clearly a lot of time to put in. But how do you go about preparing for this, for the cases?
You should know, though it may seem competitive on the stage, it's not really in any way. Most years, we don't know what the verdict is. Because most jurors, for family reasons, we've left before the lunch, and no one calls us to tell us the verdict. But that's not why we're doing it.
Unless they reoffend. And then we know.
For me, the preparation is always the most enjoyable, because I always obviously start by reading the Torah portion, but it's my chance to go and read also the Talmud commentaries on it, to see what the Talmud says. And since that's not something that I get to do usually, it's a wonderful opportunity. And then I look to see what else has been written that I can find. In this instance, what else has been written about Moses and the murder. And then there's research in the background, criminal law, to make sure that being up to speed on that. And so you're right, there's a fair amount of time that goes into it, but the preparation is such a pleasure.
I think we have a similar system, which I read what the text is. I'm somewhat limited because I don't get to decide what evidence I want to bring in. That was a pleasure I had as a prosecutor, to actually have witnesses and evidence. That goes a long way. I do as Erwin does. I try to read the commentaries. I try to think like you. What questions might I have? And then I start the part about putting together the PowerPoint, which is to add just a little bit of humor, give focus. It's what I enjoy doing. I really appreciate that Erwin takes it as such a good sport. Whether I'm putting up a slide about some of the great works that he's published, or part of the Eve, the Adam and Eve cartoon with the fig leaf was probably stretching it a bit. I realize that you're here early on a Sunday morning, and that there's both a learning component and maybe a little bit of an entertainment component, and I want to make sure that I offer both to you, not because I want to trivialize it. I really not that at all, but I rather make it memorable. And sometimes, as Rabbi Feinstein emphasized this morning, what we see is very important in my book to make it memorable. You know, you might not remember exactly why you voted against me, and I know who you are. But you might remember some of the images and the lessons those taught you. So I put those together. Erwin and I might chat on occasion, and then we come on in ready to have this type of wonderful engagement.
As I said this morning, I don't know how to use PowerPoint. I've never used PowerPoint. The good news is, in 33 years as a law professor, I've never had a student evaluation say you should have used PowerPoint. And I also know that PowerPoint is a medium that wouldn't be something I would be particularly good at. I'm not very good at the visual images, and I will never be as funny as Laurie.
Talk about the visual part of the case. Laurie, you're known to bring knives and DNA and bloods and all kind of, some will claim from targets, some will claim from the cases themselves. One of the audience member here asked, are you that animated in your real cases? When you try a real case in court, are you that animated?
More so.
More so.
Right. So because, once again, you've got a jury. And it's not enough for you to give the information to the jury. You have to, as we sort of try to do here, have the jury want to return a verdict on your side. And realize that it's all about the jury. They have to get the evidence, they have to be excited about the evidence, it has to come alive. If I could put everybody in a time machine and transport you back to the time of that offense, that would be the best way to try a case. So I have to do it otherwise. Now, I have no drama skills at all, and actually I don't consider myself very funny. And in a real murder case, I don't try to be funny. But I do realize, as I train my young lawyers, it's showtime to a certain extent. And that's because you all expect it. You've been watching Law and Order and all those shows, and imagine if you just had an attorney who just came in and did a job. Unless that person is as extraordinary as Erwin Chemerinsky, who, with a photographic memory, can speak in full paragraphs, you believe everything he has to say, it sounds so articulate. Most lawyers are not going to be able to do that. And having that enthusiasm about the case is helpful in just getting the jurors to feel, as we say, feel your pain.
I recall the first year when we put Erwin on trial, one of the jury members on the piece of paper wrote, clearly I found that Abraham is guilty, but who am I to find him guilty on such crime? And that is a question that came up, even in discussions in the office about, when we started putting this program together, can we ask people to basically judge, the founder of our religion on crimes, and put them on trial in, 2 days. So the question to you is, how would you respond to such a jury member?
I think about 500 people who fit this auditorium.
About 500, yes.
You had 500 people here this morning talking about a Torah book. You said this morning in the introduction that over 10 years you had 5,000 people come on Sunday mornings to talk about the Torah. I would think that anybody who cares about Torah would think that's a wonderful thing. Now, we use as the vehicle for that the artifice of a trial. And we use as a way of engaging everyone, making you the jury and letting you vote. But ultimately, all of that is a way of engaging in a discussion about Torah, and a discussion about incredibly important ethical and moral and social issues. So if anybody asks the question, my response is, isn't this a wonderful thing that you've been doing here all these years?
I would add to that, that's what it means to be Jewish, right? So I hate to cite Moses for this positive point. But that is the teaching, that justice is lo b'shamayim, isn't up in the heavens. Justice is here, and it is our responsibility, and it has been since Moses' time. Otherwise, those 10 Commandments won't be worth much. So not only can we, but I actually think it is our responsibility to engage in these difficult decisions regarding what's just. We do it at these trials, we do it on Yom Kippur, we should do it daily with ourselves. That's what real justice is. I don't think any of us expect that God is going to come, well, I know God's here, but sort of weigh in on the verdict. Maybe say, Laurie was right, Moses was guilty. But Hashem, God, has given us all the capability to make a decision. And that's worthy of something. I actually really respect what you decide, because that is as close to divine justice as we can get.
Before I open it to a few questions from the audience, I wanted to ask you, can you share with us one story that comes to mind from the last 10 years, of a memory or of a moment of a trial, in both preparation and actual the trial or afterwards, that comes to mind when remembering the last 10 years?
Well, Erwin has done so many fabulous things during trial. I remember in the trial of King David, or Shtuppen Bathsheba, you know that trial. And so I thought the appropriate evidence to bring in was the stained sheet. And Erwin, nonplussed. I mean, right, the guy doesn't even miss a beat. He picks it up and he said, really? They bought it at J.C. Penney's or something?
But that was the last time you left the label on
I
one of the exhibits.
know. So all the memories that I will take from this are really fond memories.
It's interesting, Laurie, to pick the trial again, because for me, it's there. That was the case that I have, because it was the one where I discovered there was no defense. I mean,
I like
you read the passage and he sent Uriah out to die on the front lines of battle so that he could, I'll use it out now. But that's what I remember that being the hardest of the 10, because I remember constantly trying to think of, hey, what can I say to defend this guy? I offered a plea bargain, but the court.
By show of hand, how many of you have been to more than 5 trials? Well, okay. More than 6? 7? Well, okay, 8? 9? All 10.
These are seasoned subscribers.
We applaud you.
Are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I'm curious, not so much this particular trial, but you talked about showmanship, and then there's also law, and then you just used the term justice. In thinking about those 3 things, they seem in conflict with each other to some extent. Because if the jury's swayed by showmanship, that's not necessarily the law. And justice often is in conflict with the law, which this trial could have been evidence of.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. In the real world, first of all, I didn't want to say that I just try to be a showwoman or showman, because the law is all important. And when you get into closing argument, if you don't have the evidence to support the law, if I can't respond to its proof beyond a reasonable doubt, I could do a pole dance. Not that I would want to. And it wouldn't make any difference. But the aspect of this trial that is different, that you actually don't get to do much in a real courtroom, is that argument for justice that Erwin so eloquently did at the end. Like, what kind of people do you want them to be? You try to do that a little bit in an American courtroom, and the judge sort of cuts you off saying, well, you know, this isn't about that. Really, Judge? It's not about justice. It's about the law. You get to do that more at sentencing, but I think it's too bad that we have such a cramped, constrained view of presenting cases to our jury. Historically, that wasn't always the case. If you go back to the history of trials in America, they were much more free-flowing. One of the great things about them, lawyers weren't in the way as much. You had the parties. And people would argue about justice. Now we actually leave it to the jurors. Kind of the dirty secret behind the room that if you don't like the law, there's that jury nullification. We don't like that you do it. But ultimately, all 3 elements are supposed to be in that trial. Erwin, what do you think?
I would approach the question differently, but I think one thing you may remember is Laurie and I come from different practice backgrounds. Laurie was primarily a trial lawyer. You've certainly done appeals. I was, and still am, an appellate lawyer. And those are very different forms of argument. Because Laurie's experience in arguing in front of a jury, I'm not. But I've argued over 100 appeals, including cases of the Supreme Court, in front of appellate judges. And those are so different in terms of the 3 elements that you point to. Now, in arguing an appeal, it's really all about the law. But I'm always looking for a reason to convince the court that they should vote for my side because it also advances the interests of justice. And in arguing to you, we want to argue to you not just based on the law, but also based on justice, to the greatest extent possible, fuse the 2. In appellate court, showmanship doesn't matter hardly. I mean, you don't have a jury. You're arguing to 3 or 5 or 7 or 9 judges or justices. And I also know, even coming to you, my strength is not the showmanship aspect of it. I'm not by nature very funny. In fact, I ask my kids always before these trials, can you help me come up with some jokes to tell? Because I know Laurie's going to be so funny. And so, for me, the showmanship, if I can do it, I'll do it. But it's really much more about trying to argue law and justice. But that's also true when you're arguing an appeal.
You touched upon the difference between law and justice. How confident are both of you that justice regularly occurs in courts of law?
The question is, how confident are we that justice occurs in courts of law? Do you want to go first?
I believe that the system as designed is the best human system for finding justice, knowing that any human system is going to inevitably be flawed. I think the systems we carry out our society is far from a system that will often produce justice. And so, for example, when you look at, let's take the inadequacy of representation for criminal defendants in our society, I worry about what that means. You know, I just heard a speaker talk about how in Alabama, somebody who's handling a death penalty case gets a maximum of $1,000 and $2,000 to handle a death penalty appeal. I did a couple of death penalty appeals in North Carolina where the lawyers that handle the trial aren't people you want representing you in traffic ticket cases. Well, if you don't have adequate representation on both sides, the system's not going to produce justice. Often, people who don't have resources can't get to court at all and can't get justice. So I think we designed a wonderful system, but we failed to put nearly the resources in it that it needs. When you look at now what they're doing in cutting the funding for courts and public defenders and representation, we're even moving further away from that idea.
And I agree with Erwin. I would add this. I actually think we are so lucky to be where we are in California. Certainly, I practice in the federal courts, and everybody there on both sides, very dedicated, saw a lot of justice done. But a lot of the work of the courts is not done in a courtroom with a jury during a trial. 95 to 97% of these cases are resolved behind the scenes, right? And that's when you have to say, what do you mean by justice? Because we give deals to people, we give deals because police officers have done things wrong. We use all that to hide the problems in the criminal justice system. So my answer is, what's justice? I know it's relative. How you get the justice you pay for, Erwin's absolutely right. There is no absolute justice, and we cut a lot of corners because we're doing so much behind the scenes. Thank you, Rob. I'll repeat the question.
But in real life, what do you do if you find that the jury is really not up to speed and not getting what you're trying to say when you talk?
So Ross Goldstein has asked. We are blessed here to have the best jurors in the world. But what do you do in the real world when the jurors, or maybe, I think your word was a little schwach, that the jurors maybe are not up to speed? What do we do when the fact that we don't have the same educated, committed jurors that you have here? You want me to answer? Okay, so here's something I want to say. I actually think that most people who do jury service are trying to do it right. And I also think that whereas I would love to have jurors who come from diverse, educated background, let me ask you, how many of you have ever tried to get out of jury service? Raise your hands, honestly. So shame on you, no? That's why we have the issue. The third thing I will say is that it's not always necessary to have brilliant jurors. What you need are jurors who have a lot of good life experience and are honest about why they're on a jury, that they don't have an agenda. So we've created sort of this split in our society that makes its way all the way into the courtroom, and that is definitely something that needs to address. But I'm not sure we can just do it in the courts. I think it's broader in society. The one thing he agrees with today.
We'll take a couple more questions. One.
I want to know what happens next year.
And we'll take another question. Right there.
Laurie and Erwin, I just want to know, if you were voting, how would you vote?
I would certainly say Erwin was the best looking counsel here today. How would I vote? I think Erwin's right. right, we needed some evidence, but I actually think that Moses probably was not entitled to use defense of another, because if he had tried yelling, "Don't do that," and the guy kept doing it, then I would say it was necessary. I would have voted not guilty on the flight. All of you who were right, except for those who voted for me just out of sympathy. Thank you. But I actually, it's a hard question, probably why we're trying it. I understand and appreciate Erwin's argument, which is, what are you going to do if you're in that situation? But the longer I thought about it, the more I thought, vigilantism is a major problem. And I don't want people using deadly force unless it really is a last resort. I believe in that firmly.
I do too. And there are years where I've stood up here and have not believed that not guilty was the appropriate verdict. I was playing a role. David is the best example of that. I think he was, and the jury, you convicted him of that. Today I really believe this was Moses standing up against injustice. I'm not going to repeat all the arguments I made. But in a slave society where you see the Egyptian beating up the slave, I just don't see that Moses would have any alternative. I'm skeptical that if somebody's walking down the streets of Nazi Germany and saw a German beating up a Jew, yelling at the German, "Don't do it," would really have the effect.
When he brings that Nazi argument in, that makes it much tougher. The truth is, given the standard of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and given who the defendants are, if I go home and say, I got 2 votes, mine and another, I always feel like it's been a good day.
And last question.
Years ago, in a nomination of the Supreme Court that was given from London to the Senate, a senator from Nebraska, I remember the name, unfortunately.
Roman Rushka
said, isn't it about, they were talking about this justice being nominated, was mediocre. And he said, isn't it about time we had some mediocrity on the United States? I wonder what your comment might be.
Please repeat.
Sure. I'll even fill in some of the details. When Harold Carswell was nominated for the United States Supreme Court by President Richard Nixon, and it was pointed out that his record was quite mediocre, Senator Rushka from Nebraska said, well, yeah, he's mediocre. Actually, what you didn't point out was what Rushka said right before the statement you quoted is, we can't expect all of our justices to be Brandeis, Cardozos, and Frankfurters, can we? And I don't think he even realized that 3 examples of the first 3 Jewish justices. His next sentence was, doesn't mediocrity deserve some representation on the Supreme Court as well? The easy answer to the question is no.
And I would add this, what we deserve on the Supreme Court, and I say this with all sincerity, is Erwin Chemerinsky. And, if we could have somebody like Erwin, who is that brilliant, that committed, with that great of a neshama, then we actually would have who we want on the Supreme Court. I, unfortunately, was not elected either a senator or a president, but I think we should never settle for mediocrity. We should embrace those who bring us to a highest level.
Laurie, I could not thank you enough for being a part of this program. If I can have 2 more minutes of your time before we finish, if I can just ask you to stay seated for the next 2 minutes. I really want to take the time and tell you that, this program, as you know, could not have been as successful, as funny, and as interesting without the 2 lawyers who are sitting next to me. And they've been doing it for 10 years, and they're doing it pro bono, and really on behalf of the university and all of us, I want to sincerely appreciate it. And also very quickly also would like to thank the staff of the Levenson Center of Continuing Education. I would like to specifically thank Susan Spector, who 10 years ago came to my office and said, Gadi, you remember this program we did in Hebrew school with the 6th graders? We should do it here. And I looked at her and I said, are you crazy? We're now working with adults. And she convinced me, and the next year we did it, and the rest is history. So thank you so much for being with us. And before we present our both lawyers with the gift, I would also like to call Jen Shulman to come up here. Where's Jen? Jen Shulman? Oh, she's right there. Jen Shulman walked into my office 13 years ago and said, I would like to volunteer. And I like, what would you like to do? And she said, whatever you need me to do. It's been 13 years and she's still volunteering full-time at the Levenson Center of Continuing Education. And one of the programs that she's been in charge of is this trial. She's been the lay person in dealing with both lawyers and the judge. She's been in charge of helping us market it and assign seats and doing lunch and all this fun stuff that goes into the program. So let's please take a moment and thank Jen Shulman for coming to